Okay, this is the last video in our topic 4.2 series, Exploration, Causes, and Events. And in this video, part 4, we're going to focus on the Northern Wave. The Northern Wave begins in about 1600 and really lasts to the end of our time period, 1750. So we know that starting in 1450, the causes of all this were new nation states developing in Europe. And these nations, suffering from the gold famine, sought to expand, sponsoring exploration and the building of maritime empires, to bring in gold and silver to not only create their market economies, but also legitimize their governments, centralize their governments, and finally become powerful. So the main effect is going to be the building of maritime empires. In video 2, we talk generally about how they're built and why they're built. In video 3, we looked at the southern wave. Now we're looking at the northern wave. And the northern wave begins in 1600 and it's going to last to the end of our time period. And it's going to be these nations that are going to be the most successful. The northern wave is going to be made up of the Netherlands, the French, and finally the English. And the reason why they didn't start this until 1600 is because they weren't ready. They did not need to because they were dealing with other things, such as actually establishing their monarchies and things like that. They had to deal with the Protestant Reformation. And you'll notice that these areas, two of them are Protestant, England and Holland. And then the last one is French. Well, they dealt with a lot of problems with the Huguenots. And then the Portuguese and the Spanish really tried to keep them away from it. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't until the Spanish Armada that the English could actually do this, but more on that later. So, what drove these three nations to explore was to find an even faster way to Asia. That is known as the Northwest Passage. Now, we all know that the Northwest Passage doesn't exist, but by 1600, they knew that the Americas were new. They also knew that they could not go to the south, but knowing the way that the Volta del Mar worked and knowing the geography of the area, they felt that there was a direct sea lane that they could take above North America that would get them to East Asia and Asia much faster than the Portuguese and the Spanish could. So, this is the main thing that was driving them. But it's the same situation where they're trying to get wealth to make their market economy go, trying to legitimize and to centralize their power, but also to try to be as powerful as the Spanish and the Portuguese. So we're going to start off with the Dutch. And the Dutch are a new nation. They were a group of Protestants that won their independence from Spanish control. And so they're a new nation. So the first thing we need to bring out is this was the home of a lot of Hanseatic League cities. Remember the Hanseatic League that first began to really control trade in the 1200 to 1450 period. So they had a tradition of a lot of financial instruments, a lot of banks, a lot of loans, certain laws that would promote this. They also were a brand new nation with a brand new navy, and their goal was to find the Northwest Passage. They, being surrounded by enemies, they very much needed to find gold. They also were Protestant, and they worked very hard and believed in the work ethic, trying to glorify God not through the amount of people that they converted, but how hard they worked. This nation was the nation that developed the flute. Remember, that's the boat that combined the great aspects of the caravel and the carrack and made trade faster and more efficient. And there's a picture of it right there. So what they did is instead of a direct control, they created these things called joint stock companies. A joint stock company is a private company that sells stocks to a pool of investors. They use this money to essentially finance exploration, colonization. So, what this does is this gives the government all the profits of exploration and colonization, but essentially limits the laws. And this is a lot of people who, they're not firstborn people, they don't inherit a lot, and so they're looking for a way to make money. This is similar to the way the stock market works today. Companies like Apple, they sell stocks, they take the resources, they run their businesses, and essentially pass on the profits to the stockholders. What you see here is the VOC, that's the top one. That is the largest and the most powerful joint stock company ever. I'll tell you more about that later. And then you have the Dutch West Indies Company, the one on the bottom with the W. So the Dutch are going to be more successful. And the reason why they're more successful is their technology was better. When they went into the Eastern Hemisphere, they didn't try to control trade. They sought just to become the biggest trading partners, to do it cheaper, faster, more efficiently. And so think of it like a company that's trying to take over. So what they're actually doing is they're literally taking over a lot of the Portuguese trading posts, which they do. They're also not concerned with converting people to Christianity. These are Protestants. And instead of spreading the word of God, what they're trying to do is simply glorifying God in what they do and letting people make their own decision. So the Dutch, they're going to take over a lot of the Portuguese outposts across the world. They also established colonies in the Western Hemisphere in New Netherlands, which is New Amsterdam, which today is New York, the island of Curacao, and Suriname. So when they governed it indirectly. They used joint stock companies. So what happens is this. These companies are given a monopoly to trade in a certain area. They're given guidelines, but the government lets them go. The government doesn't send agents. The government just says, go make us a profit. So this is a very efficient way to do this. So when we look at it, they're going to benefit and get wealth from sugar. They get sugar from Brazil, which they take over, Suriname, Curacao. They take over the Portuguese slave trade in Africa. They also get fur from the New World, and they come to control the pepper and the spice trade to Europe. When you talk about the French, well, they're very similar. Okay. Again, the French are exploring, setting out Champlain and Cartier to find the Northwest Passage, but they didn't find it. They sought to look for gold and other commodities that gave them wealth. And what they found was fur. They too were very much friendly with the natives, using them to get the fur, but there was also a degree of conversion where they wanted to spread Catholicism. This is the area where they established their colony in the Western Hemisphere. It's called New France. It's in what's today is Canada. And the main thing that comes out of that is going to be fur. So they too use joint stock companies, but the joint stock companies are going to be more controlled by the French government. But still, it's a private company. They also they really don't want a lot of migration. The French were a little bit different. They wanted to exploit the land, sending over as few people as possible. They wanted to keep a majority of their people in France to work in agriculture. Now, these were the ones that essentially created mercantilism. And we'll talk about mercantilism a little bit later in the topics. But they actually passed the first mercantile laws called the exclusive. So when we talk about how they profited, well, first of all, fur was their main thing. They also had a sugar plantation from Haiti and later are going to establish key trading posts in India at Pondicherry. So that brings us to the British. The British also were looking for the Northwest Passage. But the problem was is at the start of this, the British were very weak. Now, When they didn't find the Northwest Passage, they literally thought gold was just lying around on the eastern coast of North America. So they're going to basically send people to look for gold, and if not, they're going to basically find commodities. The greatest difference with the British is these are the people that wanted to make these permanent settlements. They wanted to offer people who didn't agree with the British government and the British Protestantism outlets of them to go live somewhere else, practice their religion, but also profit from it as well. So this is the obviously the British area of colonization. Remember, this is at the beginning. We know that by 1750 the British are going to win. But they sought in this area key commodities to be able to sell for gold and silver. Again, there's a whole lot of migration here. People owning land. One of the things that drove the British in this colonization of the Americas was the fact that there just wasn't any land in England for people to have. And so they used the lure of land to get people to move. So you can see there was a lot of migration. They too used joint stock companies for the same reason that the British and the French did. And essentially, these people, the Virginia Company would be an example, was very successful. Their main good that they found was tobacco. Okay. They called this the gold and the silver of Virginia. And essentially, tobacco became the biggie. They also grew sugar in areas in the Caribbean, cotton, things like that. Now, the British had a very unique labor system, and I'm not going to get much into labor systems in this, but how did they get people to move there? Well, they used two systems. First, we have the headright system. So if you're a rich person and you're in the Americas, for every person you pay passage to, you get 50 acres of free land. So those that came over, they were under an indenture. If you are somebody who has their passage paid for, you owe that person 5 to 7 years of labor. At the end, you're promised freedom dues, which basically is money in terms of pound, but also land. Remember, it's very difficult to get land in England. Now, while you're working, you're forbidden to marry, you're forbidden to do a bunch of stuff. But this was very difficult. Between 1610 and 1614, 1 out of every 10 people actually outlived their indentured. And those that did outlive their indenture, well, what happens is they're given land right on the frontier. For example, up here where we are in Forsyth County, Hall County, this is the land that was given to them, and it bordered right on Cherokee lands, and a lot of people were massacred. But those that were successful, they became successful. So again, what's happening here is through the building of maritime empires to bring gold and silver into these countries, we have this new globalized system of world trade. So key takeaways from all of these videos. When you talk about causes, the causes were internal and external factors that are motivating the leaders of European nation states to establish and expand maritime empires. They need wealth in the form of precious metals to do many things, to legitimize their government, to consolidate their power, to create a market economy, and to essentially make their state powerful. That the existing pattern of trade that went through Istanbul, through the Italians, did not provide enough money for this. So this is where exploration comes in. These states and governments sought to become involved in exploration to find trade routes that would give them gold and silver, to find gold and silver, and to find things they could sell for it. So this leads to the creation of maritime empires. This is the main effect. This takes place in two waves. From 1450 to 1600, the Spanish and the Portuguese built maritime empires in the Eastern Hemisphere, which was the Portuguese, and that's trading post. And the Western Hemisphere, that's the Spanish. And from 1600 and 1750, the French, the Dutch, and the English built theirs across the world. Now, I'd pause the video. Maybe you want to take a picture of this. But this concludes topic 4.2.